right. So I should say Gregg is the co-author of a couple of books. There's one called Rejecting Retributivism, which I'm sure that'll come up very quickly. There's also, we alluded to earlier, a book of kind of battling back and forth essays with Daniel Dennett called Just Desserts, Debating Free Will. And some of Gregg's views about this came up a little bit at the last season. We had David Pizarro from Very Bad Wizards on, and we were talking about kind of G.A. Cohen and free will and related subjects. But Gregg, what is your basic view about all of this stuff?
Well,
I know that's a giant question. Let me try to.
It's easy enough. I'm a free will skeptic, so I deny. Well, basically, I maintain that who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control, and we could talk about what kind of factors those might be. And because of that, we're never morally responsible in a really particular sense, the kind of sense that most philosophers debate. It's sometimes called the basic desert sense. Basically, it's the sense that would make you truly deserving of praise and blame and punishment and reward, and certain types of reactive attitudes like resentment and indignation and moral anger. It's also the kind of moral responsibility that's needed to justify things like retributive punishment. So basically, I say agents do not have this kind of free will or moral responsibility. And I define philosophers have to define their terms. And so I define free will as the control and action that's required for this kind of responsibility. And it's a pretty standard way of defining it, especially among philosophers that write about free will. And I argue that we just lack this kind of control because ultimately who we are and what we do is the result of these factors that drain back the sources antecedent to the agent and are ultimately beyond the control of the agent.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, let's just so everybody knows where everybody stands. So Ryan has written a couple things about this, including a award-winning doctoral dissertation. So that was I think that was actually really useful for contrast, right? Especially with the the definition, because there actually is going to be a shared definition here. But Ryan, what's your view about free will?
So I do work with the same, like Gregg said. The common definition of free will is what is the kind of control that's necessary to have real moral responsibility. And so I have a view, and a lot of your viewers already know this, but my view is a view called compatibilism. So I'm in the camp. So I'm opposed to Gregg in a couple of ways, but there's some things we have in common too. But the big thing is that while I agree that I'm not bringing anything non-naturalist or supernatural or contra-causal, but what compatibilists argue is that even if the universe is completely causally deterministic and physical or whatever, or even if you throw in determinism in ways that probably don't make a difference on compatibilist views, that we can still have kinds of control. And that's something skeptics will agree with. They'll agree that there are kinds of control we can have even if determinism is true. But the big thing for compatibilists is they'll say the kinds of control and the kinds of abilities we have to reflect on our reasons and shape our characters over time can be sufficient for us to have to ground real moral responsibility. So basically that the kind of free will that we can have, even if determinism is true, is really this responsibility desert grounding kind of free will.
Right. So why don't we? I'm trying to think about what the most useful way into this is. I guess maybe it would be for Ryan to just say a little bit more about what Okay, so you both think that the kind of free will that you're interested in is whatever kind of control we would have to have over our actions in order for in order for moral responsibility to make sense, right? In order for you to to be at fault, right? Morally at fault if you do it, something wrong, or the opposite of that. If you do something right, so maybe so the issue has got to be like what that would be, right? I mean, what kind of control would be necessary for that. I mean, I think we kind of got a little bit from Gregg by implication, right? Like what he thinks it would have to be, given what he's denying. But maybe we could just do. Oh, sorry. Do you want to throw in?
Well, no, there are different ways you could go about it. I mean, for me, the kind of clearest way. So there's different. Basically, what I try to do as a free will skeptic is look at all of the different views that could preserve this kind of control and action, and I argue that each fails for different reasons. And as an end result, free will skepticism is the only sort of rational position left standing. And I think, one way to start is to say that Ryan and I agree on why some of the other accounts fail, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So he's a compatibilist, I'm a free will skeptic. As such, I think we would probably agree that certain libertarian accounts fail. And libertarian here doesn't mean political view of libertarianism. This is a kind of metaphysical view about free will. And basically it says that for agents to have the kind of control and action, their actions have to be causally undetermined. And then there are different ways they cash that out. I mean, I don't want to get too technical, but it breaks into two general kind of camps. One that posits these indeterminacies just at the level of events. So at the level of events, you might say maybe at the quantum level, there's some fundamental indeterminacy. And then there's another kind called agent causation that introduces more robust notions of agency, where an agent could be the cause of their own actions, but themselves uncaused. They could kind of create ex nihilo out of nothing. And I think each of these fails for different reasons. And I think Ryan and I probably agree about that.
Yeah.
Well, let's maybe slow down on that a little bit, right? Because I think a lot of people who are maybe just a little bit familiar with this stuff, I think that's the kind of free will that they're imagining is mostly under discussion, right? Is something is something like this, right? So let's.
I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
I mean, I think. So let's start with. I mean, just what if you want to just say like, let's start with the event. Event causal libertarianism, right? So like, what do people with this position think is going on? Like when we make a free decision, it has to be going on for us to make a free decision.
I'll take a stab. So the version of this I'm most familiar with, but is Robert Kane. He's probably the most popular version of this model, but a lot of other people like John Lemos and some other people have developed similar kinds of views. Bolliger, yeah. So the basic idea is that they want to argue on these event causal views. They want it to be scientifically respectable. They're not trying to bring in souls or robust agents or anything metaphysical. So what they want to argue is that that quantum indeterminacies can work their way into our decision-making process in such a way that you can avoid some of the arguments for that motivate incompatibilism. You can still have free will. So on Kane's basic model, the way he argues it is it might be the case that maybe most of our choices are causally determined by what's going on at the brain at a given moment. But he says there are these key moments, what he calls self-forming actions, where the agent will be torn between two choices. So they'll be really motivated. So his example is like a businesswoman who's on her way to like an important meeting, and she passes by someone who's being mugged in the alley. So she has a choice. She can either stop and help the person, or she can go on to the meeting. And so we imagine that she's really torn here. So she like has motives and desires and interests in helping the person. She also has motives and desires driving and reasons driving her to go to the meeting. And so Kane suggests, I think without too much evidence, but he suggests in this moment, the brain might end up in this kind of chaotic state where it's sensitive to these very minor quantum fluctuations. So where the choice could really go either way. And so he says, so the choice really could go either way. It's not causally determined by your background, by your genes, by the laws of physics, by the Big Bang. We can't predict what's going to happen. But whatever happens, the choice is going to be something that was a product of the businesswoman's beliefs and desires and reasons and cognitive capacities. So this is a way he wants to like avoid the problem of determinism and still have like a respectable account of free choice without bringing anything metaphysical in. Did I do justice to that?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's exactly. And I would just add, the quantum indeterminacies also have to percolate up to the level of neural networks. And he has he has this kind of what I've attacked as well is kind of controversial notion of dual willings. You have to will both outcomes simultaneously, which is sort of strange, both phenomenologically. We don't typically feel ourselves sort of willing. And it's not exactly the example of a kind of rational agent willing P and not P simultaneously. So my basic argument against that kind of view is that the agent would lack the ability to settle which outcome ultimately occurs. So it's an issue of settling. And so settling for me is a kind of control in action. It's a kind of robust control in action. And it's a kind of control in action that would be needed for agents to be responsible for these outcomes. And in the event causal indeterminist account, all causation happens at the level of events. And if true indeterminacy is involved in this proximal chain just prior to action, the agent really doesn't settle which outcome. They will both outcomes simultaneously, and then it's a matter of indeterminacy which one actually wins out. So like if you were to rewind time and replay it over and over again, you get this probabilistic set of outcomes probably.
So I did just want to highlight, right, because I think I've heard at least two objections, and I think even though we haven't gotten really to the what either of you think yet, but I think the reason this is worth maybe taking a second on is that if you want to if you want to say that we have that kind of free will that you would need to determinism to be false, to have that, and you want to you don't want to say anything too weird or supernatural or whatever, right? This seems like a pretty good candidate, but there are at least two kinds of problems here. One, Ryan kind of hinted at this. There's no particular reason to think this happens, right? I mean, like that's like it's you're taking a sort of like, well, if the physics turns out just right, and then not just the physics, but the neuroscience and whatever.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, we don't even know if quantum mechanics is really indeterministic for starters.
So like it's like, okay, if you assume a lot of things, you probably that are very much like up in the air and like it don't seem like very safe assumptions, then maybe it works this way, right? That's one worry. But then the other one, and I think is going to be maybe even more important, is what Greg said, I think with the thing about settling. So, and I'm not sure if this is exactly the same point or not, but it's like that that look, if you are conflicted about something and ultimately there's some kind of like quantum coin flip in your brain, then, just intuitively the objection is okay, but I didn't decide which of those two things would happen, right? This physical process that's ultimately outside of my control, even if it's indeterministic decided it.
Yeah, if I could expand on it. So I think those are two objections. There are actually probably more. I've raised more in my work, but just to focus on those two, regarding the first one, the kind of empirical constraint, the theory posits all kinds of things, and none of the people who defend the theory actually suggest the world works this way. As you said, Ben, they're just trying to set out a possible naturalistic account of free will that can conceivably be true and isn't yet disproven by science. That's sort of what the goal is. In fact, one of the main proponents of this view, Al Mealy, has a version of this account but doesn't endorse it as true, in part because we don't have any evidence the brain works this way. So not only do indeterminacies have to really exist, quantum mechanics has to be fundamentally, indeterministic. They have to exist at the right neural level. Oh yeah, also they have to be able to percolate up to the level of neural networks. Oh yeah, also they have to occur at exactly the right temporal moment in time, the moment after you will bolt inconsistent outcomes. And we have no evidence to think any of that is true, and probably good reason to think none of that is going to actually turn out to be the case. The more philosophical objection is the settling objection. Sometimes it's called the disappearing agent objection, or even the luck objection, is that the agent disappears at the crucial moment. They disappear at exactly the moment when the outcome or the behavior has to be settled, right? When the agent has to decide, the businesswoman has to decide to go to the meeting or help the person in need. And so sometimes, people put this as an objection of luck. I see the disappearing agent objection and luck objection to be subclasses of each other, but slightly distinct. There are other problems with the theory as well, just to throw in a few more. The concept of dual willings seems to not fit with our traditional understanding of rational agency. And just to get back to the kind of moral part, just imagine this, like I go to some conference and I'm not this kind of person, but just to say I was, some beautiful woman is flirting with me, and I simultaneously will to give in to temptation and simultaneously will to remain faithful to my wife. According to Kane, this felt indeterminacy corresponds to some real indeterminacy in my brain that percolate up to the level of neural networks. So one represents the will to give in to temptation, one represents the will to remain faithful. And ultimately, which occurs is a matter of a quantum flipping of a coin. So let's say I remain faithful. And I go home to my wife and I say, hey, you know what? I willed to cheat on you, but quantum indeterminacy settled that I remain faithful. I deserve praise.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone would think that in that situation, deserve to be praised for remaining faithful when I willed to not be faithful. And it was a matter of quantum outcomes that I did remain faithful.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a nice point. Nice. Yeah. And yeah, so yeah, I kind of see the luck objection, the disappearing objection a little differently. So I'm less concerned about the luck objection, as you can probably guess. And I'm sure we'll get into the luck problem. But there, the disappearing agent really does, like, even in a compatibilist sense, like the agent just vanishes. Like that nothing in the agent's intentional states or beliefs or desires settles what happens. It just happens independently of anything the agent does, and that seems like not a good model for a free choice.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of imagine the I don't know. It's like there was a Community episode where they have like this. They're rolling this many-sided die, and it like branches off into alternate universes for all the outcomes, right? It's like there's something like, patting yourself on the back because you're in the universe where it split off into the one where you didn't do it. Seems like weird. Okay, so fair enough. Let's talk maybe just real quickly, just to canvas a few of the big options about the other kind of libertarianism. So so Greg, you mentioned earlier, right? There's like event causal libertarianism, and there's agent causal libertarianism, which is supposed to get around some of these problems.
Right. So I actually think agent causal libertarianism would provide us with the control and action needed for basic desert moral responsibility. I just think that we have good reason to think we are not agent causal, agents, in the sense that agent causal libertarianism requires some really robust metaphysical commitments that I think are hard to defend and justify given our best philosophical and scientific theories about the world. So my objections to agent causal libertarianism, multiple.
Sorry, before we do the objections, I just want to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about. Yeah. So
in this case, the agent is a substance, not an event. And they have certain unique causal powers. They have the ability to cause physical events in the world, but they themselves are causally undetermined. So basically, you, the agent, you, Ben, or you, Ryan, are the cause of your actions, but you're completely undetermined by all these antecedent events, your childhood, your brain chemistry. But that requires a kind of agency that is, and that the agent has this kind of sui generis ability, this kind of ability to cause physical events without being causally determined, requires the agent to not be determined by their brain events. That is, I, Gregg Caruso, am not just what neurons are firing or what chemicals are being released in my brain, what synapses, are being triggered in this particular event, because those all involve event causal sequences that presumably would be determined by the laws of neurobiology and physics and chemistry. So the agent has to be, the substance that makes you the agent has to not be completely determined by those lower level physical events. They have to be either some kind of an emergent agent, and I mean a radically emergent agent, and not just like a prosaic kind of acceptable kind of emergence, a kind of more radical emergence where a new substance emerges at this higher level that's distinct and can't be determined by the lower level activities. We have no reason to think that agents are those kind of things. It violates certain kinds of scientific principles I think could be defended, like physical causal closure, that if any event is caused in the physical realm, that event's causes have to themselves be physical events. It also probably suffers from the luck objection. Some, like Al Mealy, argues that it doesn't really get around the luck. It seemingly gets around the luck objection, but it's unclear that it does. And it's also hard to see how this would be reconciled with any understanding of the physical laws of nature, whether those physical laws be deterministic or indeterministic. Because if they were indeterministic laws of nature, and they were genuine probabilities, you would say that given a certain number of flippings of the coin, you should see this distribution. So let's say the probability should be 32% of the time you get this outcome, and this percentage you get this outcome. Well, the agent causal theorist has to be able to posit that agents could cause actions in ways that disrupt those probabilistic outcomes. That is, I should be able to do things that I'm not determined by even probabilistic laws of nature. In which case, then what the agent does either has to violate those fundamental laws of nature, or you have to posit somehow consistencies that are beyond credibility. You have to say that there's just turns out that they correlate, that agents just happen to pick that outcome 32% of the time. But we don't have any evidence that that's the case, and we have no evidence that they violate the fundamental laws of nature. So either way, it seems kind of be empirically falsifiable in a certain way.
Yeah. So I just want to make sure that everybody is following the thread of this. So they have it's okay. I'm just just paranoid. I don't want to be like Tim Pool. So I have a like one way of framing this is you say, okay, look, ancient causal libertarianism says no, it's not some quantum coin flip in my head that's causing the thing. It's me. I'm causing it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but what is me, right? Like, what would me have to be, right, for this to get around physical determinism, right? It would have to either be that somehow, right, I'm like a little, I'm like a little unmoved mover, right? I have,
exactly.
I'm doing like kind of what God is supposed to do, right? Creating things without being created, right? They have like
you have godlike powers on this account.
Yeah. Either I have godlike powers to cause effects in the physical world without my action, without my decisions themselves being traceable back to those, or maybe physical, maybe it's just that every time I make a decision, right, I could do A, I could do B. If I do A, it just so happens that A was what was physically determined to happen. which would mean that, I don't know. I mean,
coincidence is beyond.
Yeah, I mean, what's the number of free action, of like, what's the number of actions of the kind that, if any actions are free, right, we would hope would be included in those, right? What are the number of decisions that somebody makes in like one day, multiplied by however many billion people in the world? This is a lot of like weird cosmic coincidences going on.
Yeah. I mean, for your listeners, if they're familiar at all with dualism or Descartes was a dualist who believed the mind was distinct from the body and that we were made up of two different substances, one being physical material substances that are extended in space and time and have mass and location. Oh, and we're also minds, non-physical, non-material substances that are not extended in space. Descartes was a libertarian. Now, not all libertarians have to be dualists, but dualism is one way you free the agent from the deterministic laws of nature. Now, one really famous problem for that view, which is another objection.
And just parenthetically, in some ways, it'd be even weirder if you're not a dualist, right? Like, you have, like it's just your physical brain for some reason is immune from normal laws of causation.
Yeah. And I would say, one common problem in that dualism is how to explain the interaction between these physical material substances and non-physical, Descartes said, pineal gland, which was hilarious for a number of reasons. He gave us a where when we need a how. He gave us like, it happens at the pineal gland. And second, there's no reason to think the pineal gland is that significant. So it's it missed the mark on two accounts. But that problem actually still exists for agent causal libertarians. And I argue in my first book, actually, also in the Rejecting Retributivism, that they have a hard time accounting for mental causation. And one of the reasons is that they posit a kind of metaphysical substance that's hard to explain how mental causation would occur in any way that doesn't just posit mysteries or godlike abilities.
Right. Okay. So we've got, if you think that we have free will, which we're all using to be the kind of control that's required for moral responsibility, we've gone through a couple of different libertarian ways of making sense of that. Libertarian in the context just meaning the kind of free will that would be incompatible with determinism, has much more honorable form of libertarianism than the other kind, and then
and I think it came first.
Yes, that's true. But one issue, not the only issue, there are also worries about luck, but one issue about both of those is that they seem to postulate just things about the way that the physical world, which human brains are part of, work that just don't seem to, seem like they're probably false given everything that we know about how the physical world works. So this would be a good time, I think, to go through, we'll just pick one very specific kind of compatibilism, the one that we have a representative of with us right now. So Ryan, do you have a way of making sense of the control condition of moral responsibility? Because this is what I actually want to see you guys argue about. That doesn't violate anything about how the physical world seems to work, and what is it, and why do you think that's good enough for moral responsibility?
Okay. So I mean, there are actually a lot of accounts that are kind of influential to me, but I'll pick one that's been very influential, which is this view by John Martin Fisher and Mark Revisa, which characterizes the kind of control we need in terms of responsiveness to reasons. The very basic idea is that there is a kind of control that we have, even if everything is causally determined. And so who we are is ultimately traceable back to our early upbringing, the laws of physics and our genes and whatever. We still have this ability to recognize, understand, and react, at least to some degree, to guide our behavior in accordance with reasons. And specifically for moral responsibility, I can understand and react to moral reasons. So assuming I'm a basically competent, non-sociopathic adult, I can understand the moral reasons not to commit murder. I can understand the moral reasons not to steal. And if I transgress, if I, if for whatever reason I succumb to temptation and steal something or do something I know that I shouldn't do, then I can be expected to answer and held to account for what I did. But most of the time, being a competent adult, I can be motivated by and understand and guide my behavior in response to those reasons. So that's just like a very quick thumbnail sketch of the kind of control that I think is important for moral responsibility. I think sufficient for moral responsibility, though of course Gregg will disagree. And then as for why this kind of account is important or necessary for responsibility. So there's a big tradition which Fisher reviews even a lot of skeptics are influenced by, which is P.F. Strawson. So P.F. Strawson, the way he characterizes moral responsibility is in terms of the reactive attitudes. So kind of like the place I like to start is to look at our personal relationships. And so the kinds of things, like if I'm dealing with a friend or a family member, or even just an acquaintance with whom I have a relationship and certain moral expectations, assuming they're a competent adult and they can guide their behavior by reasons, and then they transgress against me, it seems appropriate for me to have certain attitudes towards them, what Strawson calls the reactive attitudes. So it seems appropriate for me to get angry or be resentful or demand an apology, maybe inflict some sort of consequences, shaming or withdrawing my friendship or whatever. And those reactions seem appropriate, and they seem appropriate precisely because the other agent had this kind of control that I'm talking about. They understood the nature of their action. They had the ability to guide their action by reasons. So it's appropriate for me to hold them to account for what they did in this kind of way. And to not...
I do just want to interject for 10 seconds to say that just so nobody gets this wrong, right? Like on your account, what you're definitely not saying is, I mean, it might be true, but it's not what you're saying, that it'll have like good consequences if people, I don't know, can somehow make themselves have these reactions, or, they pretend to have those reactions or whatever, right? That it'll be like, that there's some sort of like utilitarian reason to do this. That's not the point.
That's not my view. Yeah. So, I mean, and so that's a whole big can of worms. So a lot of compatibilists have tended to defend these views on consequentialist grounds. And then of course, and Gregg has critiques of that, to say that's not real responsibility if it's just a consequentialist consideration.
Yeah. Which I will say I kind of agree with him about, but that doesn't really seem like what we're looking for. Like, I mean, if there are good consequences, if I act irresponsible, fine. But I mean, I think what we're really talking about whether you are responsible.
That's right. Yeah. So I mean, in my view, it's just these things feel appropriate. Just there's kind of constitutive of what it is to have relationships with people and what it is to be a human being in a society and in relationships engaged with other people. That these attitudes are sort of constitutive of that. And so their value is intrinsic, and their appropriateness is intrinsic on my view. So I mean, that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of the kind of view that I defend. Yeah.
All right. I think for the next few minutes, I'd like to largely fade into the background. Gregg, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, thanks, Ryan. That's a good summary of the position. I mean, on the one hand, at least, Ryan's a real compatibilist. In the book with Dennett, we get into this problem about the consequentialist defense. And so I don't have to get into that today. Thank you.
Yeah. I just reread that book, and I was like, I love Dennett. Like I value so much what he does, but it was frustrating by the end. You trying to pin down exactly what his views
and I get frustrated at the end. No, right. So let me start with some points of agreement. I mean, I think the first thing is, as a free will skeptic, we don't have to deny that these compatibilist distinctions are relevant. I think the difference between agents who are reasons responsive and agents who are not reasons responsive is an important one. I think the difference between someone suffering from a severe mental disability versus a competent agent is a morally relevant distinction and plays important roles both in criminal justice and interpersonal affairs. What I disagree with is that these are enough or sufficient to ground the kind of moral responsibility that's under dispute. So there's two ways, people tend to argue against compatibilism. I'll just mention them and then say which one I prefer. There's two different ways to argue. One is that determinism, if it were true, would be inconsistent with compatibilism because it rules out the ability to do otherwise. And sometimes it's called leeway in compatibilism. So it says, well, if determinism is true, when I chose to pick this shirt or when I chose what to eat for breakfast, I couldn't have chosen a different shirt. I couldn't have chosen something different if determinism is true, where determinism is the thesis that events in the remote past in conjunction with the laws of nature entail as only one fixed future. And if there's only one fixed future, there's no forking paths. What the agent does is the only thing they could have done. And hey, is that, that doesn't really preserve the kind of free will we care about. I used to be enamored with those kind of arguments. I've tended not to defend them anymore because defending the ability to do otherwise is gotten extremely difficult in the philosophical literature, and there's this whole thing coming out of Harry Frankfurt and a literature that's created epicycles among epicycles, and if you go down that rabbit hole, it's really, I don't think the Harry Frankfurt stuff works in the end, but his attempt was to argue that this ability to do otherwise is not necessary for free will. So what I tend to do is go the other way, and this is what's called sourcing compatibilism. It says that if determinism is true, the agent ultimately isn't the source of their actions in an appropriate sense because the source drains back to antecedent events that predate the agent or even go back to the Big Bang, let's say. So the best way, I think, to run my argument against and it's not my argument, it's a very standard argument against compatibilism, is to defend what's known as the manipulation argument. And so there are different ways you could run this argument, but the basic idea is if you have an agent, and this agent is causally determined by, say, a team of neuroscientists. Let's say they have some device implanted in their brain, and this could be controlled remotely, let's say, by a team of neuroscientists. And these neuroscientists manipulate the person's brain, but they manipulate the person in a way that is consistent and satisfies all the compatibilist conditions for free will. That is, the agent is responsive to reasons. They're not coerced in the way that, someone who is a kleptomaniac would be coerced to steal versus an agent who's not a kleptomaniac. They satisfy all the conditions. And let's say the team of neuroscientists directly manipulate this person, causing in them an egoistic desire. And this egoistic desire determines that they choose to kill some individual for personal gain. Most people have the intuition that this individual is not free, or in the sense that's needed for this kind of robust moral responsibility. Because they say, well, the agent was successfully manipulated by this team of neuroscientists and therefore shouldn't be blamed in this basic sense or, punished in a retributive sense because they were ultimately manipulated. And then the argument essentially proceeds to say that, and they could do this through sequencing cases. Sometimes what Peerboom has his 4-case manipulation argument, where he starts with this overt kind of manipulation where the neuroscientists directly cause me to choose to kill some individual for personal gain. And then a second case where they set up the conditions earlier in my life that determine me to later in life have this egoistic desire and then choose to kill this individual for personal gain. And then you could go to a more prosaic kind of manipulation where I'm manipulated or brainwashed by a community of people. Think about someone like an occult, or someone who's raised as a white supremacist. The people in their community brainwash them to have certain beliefs and desires and psychological states, and then they make these choices based on that manipulated psychology. And the argument is that the agent isn't free in any of these manipulated cases because ultimately what they did is the result of factors beyond their control. And then the argument, the last step of the argument, is to say there's no relevant moral distinction between these cases of manipulation and the cases of ordinary determinism. And And because in both cases, what is ultimately undermining the agent's responsibility is that their actions were the result of factors beyond their control. So if they're not responsible in the manipulated case, they shouldn't be held morally responsible in the case of ordinary determinism. Because again, in the case of ordinary determinism, what they do is ultimately the result of their inner psychological states, right? I agree with Ryan that the compatibilist account, what distinguishes it is that it says, I make some choice. My choice is preceded by some deliberation. And that deliberation is determined by the balance of my inner psychological states, my wants, my desires, my preferences. And the compatibilist essentially is saying, as long as that causal chain goes through those mechanisms within the agent, we should hold them responsible. What the manipulation cases show, or at least they make vivid, is that those inner psychological states themselves are causally determined, whether they're causally determined by an external manipulator or they're causally determined by my upbringing and my past and my childhood and my brain chemistry. They're caused. And if the compatibilist is saying agents could be free and determined at the same time, and yet we have this really strong intuition that they're not free and morally responsible in the manipulated cases, we should have the same conclusion in the case of ordinary determinism. Because the only difference is how those inner states became determined. But that shouldn't be relevant, really, because ultimately the compatibilist view is that agents can be determined by their inner psychological states and still be held morally responsible.
Yeah, that's good. So I'll try. So yeah, so this is one of the hardest arguments I think for the compatibilist to deal with is so what the compatibilist has to do is argue that there is some difference between being determined by another agent and just ordinary.
Well, let me just jump in. There are some that go the other way. There's
that's true. Yeah. So I guess the two.
There's a hardline reply that says no, they're responsible even in the case of external manipulation. But go ahead.
That's right. Yeah, and so actually, I mean, I think sometimes so. Yeah, so I like McKenna's work on this stuff. And so in part of my dissertation, I go through that and I say, and I kind of argue depending on how you spell out the exact details of the count, sometimes the hardline reply would be the appropriate one. So sometimes just bite the bullet and say, yep, even though there is some weird external manipulation going on here, the agent satisfies the conditions and is responsible. But with that really extreme case, let's start with the most extreme, most overt manipulation. In that kind of case, it seems like the agent just kind of isn't in control at all. The agent is just the agent is a puppet of another agent. And so part of the problem there is so this is something else that a lot of compatibilist accounts will bring into it, like Fisher and Urviza, is an ownership condition on the mechanisms that produce your behavior. And so what might be what it seems to me is driving the intuitions there is that someone else is in charge of the mechanisms, not you. There's some other agent who's in charge of the mechanisms. And so especially in that most extreme version of the case, even if so let's say the agents are trying to manipulate me to rob a bank or something, and they want me to keep robbing banks. The neuroscientists are making me rob banks. They want me to get a bunch of money for whatever reason. So in that case, even if counterfactually I stopped and reflected on it and decided, you know what, I don't actually have good reasons to rob these banks. What would ordinarily be an ability to have that kind of control over my character over time, where I can reflect on my desires and take steps to change which desires are going to lead me to action, could not even counterfactually be causally effective there, because the neuroscientists will just come in and say, oh, well, we don't like that line of reasoning and where that's going. We'll zap that and make sure it steers back towards however they want to do it. That they're gonna mess with my brain and make sure it steers back towards robbing the bank. So I mean, I think the basic point is, I think what's driving the intuition is the presence of the other agents. Not the fact that not that it's being traced to something outside of my control, but yeah.
So we could get to the other cases in a second. So there's a couple things I guess I would want to say here. So one thing is there are ways to come up with, and I come up with a case in my book, Rejecting Retributivism, where we don't have to have an external agent. So you could imagine a case where, like, so let's say someone with Parkinson's has a brain implant to disrupt their tremors. And the device is meant, for this therapeutic purpose, right? Not to manipulate agents, right? But let's say there's some kind of like misfire in the computer, some kind of a cat walks across the keyboard, or just there's a glitch in the system, and it temporarily in the agent causes a egoistic desire that's consistent with the agent's preferences. The agent would approve of this preference of themselves, right? Satisfies all the capacity. There's no external agent. We seem to satisfy some kind of ownership, and we don't have this external manipulator. And yet I think most people's intuitions is still this agent shouldn't be held responsible.
So,
let me also say, there's a second reply I would just throw in to respond to both. I'm familiar with kind of Fisher's thing here about the ownership condition. One is there's two ways to reply to this. I mean, one is like it could be begging the question, just because you build it in as a kind of post hoc way to get around manipulation cases. But the other way is just like in the second case of Pierre-Boom's 4-case analogy, where you set up the conditions earlier in the individual's life. It does seem this satisfies the ownership condition. And because over time the agent is approving of these aspects of themselves, they have time to adjust, and yet they have ownership over the mechanisms, and yet it's all being manipulated from an initial set of conditions. So if you're familiar with Al Neely's zygote example, right, that's a case where some angel sets up earlier in one's life. They pick the sex cells, the zygote, what makes up the individual's DNA, and then they control, like Truman, right, the initial characters and people that who I go to first grade with, who my second grade teacher was, who becomes my best friend in third grade, and all of this is sort of designed so that I like rob a liquor store on my 21st birthday. And these, the team of angels is really good at what they do, and just as they had planned 21 years earlier, I rob this liquor store, and I do so on mechanisms I own and approve of, and I'm responsive to. And yet I think still many people have this really strong intuition that the agent lacks the kind of sourcehood I think that's needed in this particular case, the ground control. But
good. So let me think. So I'll take the zygote argument first. So like the zygote argument, I'm kind of two minds about this, but that's one where I'm kind of inclined just to take the hardline reply there and say like, like if the person went through in their normal life and just like a normal agent, like spent their whole life like reflecting on their desires and crafting their character and thinking in some instances like, okay, I'm going to reinforce this desire, I'm not going to reinforce this desire, I'm going to accept this reason and try and guide my behavior.
Of course, the reasons why they approve of one desire and others, it's self-causally determined.
It's all causally determined, of course, and I'm totally fine with that. But but over the course of their life, they still have exerted a kind of control over the kind of person that they became. And it just so happens the whole thing was set in motion by this angel who wanted me to rob a bank on my birthday, but. I still feel like, I mean, the angel is to blame, and also I'm to blame. Like I'm kind of okay. Just I think taking the hard line in that case.
So I would say, go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think it's really, I don't know. Actually, I'd be maybe interested in some studies on this, but I think that I suspect, right, that a lot of people would hear the the team of angels making sure who you're going to go to first grade with and all that stuff, right? That like given the thought, well, if the bank robber had gone to different people, gone to school with different people and had different experiences and this and that and the other thing had been true, then they might not have done that, right? That they could have that thought, right? So they in other words, the thought of causal determinism, at least loosely, right, is already there, and still have the intuition that they're responsible for that, right? But that you throw in the team of angels, right? And even though it's the same mechanism after that, right? Like that still pulls against the intuition that you're responsible, which does, which I guess is what Ryan was getting at with saying, like, okay, like what's really driving the intuition here, right? I mean, is the reason that we think that the team of angels, right, having set all this up, right, is responsibility destroyed? If it is, right, is that it's is the determinism, right? That there's this chain of causes that lead you to do what you do, or is the reason that it's that there's the team of angels, right? Is the reason the presence of another agent? And I understand the Parkinson's thing was meant to undermine that, right? That that's
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I would say is the unifying thing that undermines it, the moral responsibility in all the cases, is that it traces back the causes beyond the control of the agent. And that includes the external manipulators, but it also includes the kind of cases of natural determinism.
Yeah.
I mean, if I could respond to the hardline reply, I mean, I guess there's...
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, it's a couple of things. I mean, one is it's just a battle of intuitions, and I don't want to get into a battle of intuitions. And but I don't think the incompatibilist has to rely wholly on intuitions here. I mean, the argument could just be something like whatever sourcehood is, at the end of the day, this is, like, by definition, a case that lacks the appropriate kind of sourcehood. And whatever it is that the agent lacks in this case, then that's the kind of sourcehood that's needed for responsibility. The other thing, though, I think is more convincing, and this is sort of coming from Piraboom as well, is what's the right initial kind of psychological stance to take in these manipulation cases. So the hardliner is basically arguing in the inverse. The hardliner says, like, let's take the 4-case argument, right? And they sort of say, well, the hard line is the agent is morally responsible, even in the most extreme case of manipulation, when the neuroscientists trigger in me this egoistic desire and I kill this person. And then they agree there's no relevant distinction between these cases of manipulation and the case of normal determinism, and therefore conclude that the agent in the case of normal determinism is also morally responsible. I say that that's question begging, right? Or actually, I should say the opposite direction. The hard incompatibilist reasoning, the compatibilist hardline reply is kind of the opposite. In the case of natural determinism, since agents are free and morally responsible, and there's no relevant difference between these agents and the case of manipulation, they're morally responsible in these cases. That seems to be begging the question, because the question we were after is whether or not agents in the case of normal determinism are actually free. So I think that the appropriate stance to take is a kind of neutral inquirer kind of position, which says we're not committed to whether determinism is compatible or incompatible with free will and moral responsibility. And what we allow in the manipulation type argument, whether it's the 4-case argument or the zygote or any, is to allow these cases to clarify our intuitions. And there, I think it's a harder stance to take the hardline reply, because there's no in principle footing you have for saying this agent is responsible, other than your commitment that they're responsible in the case of natural determinism.
Yeah, so
I'm not sure if that made sense. I didn't articulate as well.
No, I think I got what you're saying. So I think the compatibilists who, even if they want to take the really hardline reply in the like intense manipulation case, and so like so there's like that kind of like we'll do the 4-case argument in reverse. I think they can do better than begging the question. So I think you can appeal to a lot of like common kinds of examples where we're fully aware that people are causally determined, and we still find things that they do praiseworthy or admirable or blameworthy.
That's begging the question, though, because those are the cases where that's what's philosophically under dispute. We might naturally feel that way, but whether those emotions are justified or not. And maybe this will get us into the reactive attitude stuff.
This is getting back to like my starting point is to like look at us in our relationships with people and the attitudes that constitute those relationships, and say, okay, like those are kind of internally justified, right? These constant, so things like love and resentment and praise and blame are like just they're built into our friendships and our loving relationships and our family relationships. and we all kind of and so like and we all kind of recognize it, at least in some cases, like these things are very determined, like a mother who you know, loves her child and makes huge sacrifices for her child. I think most people are just we're like, yeah, of course, like this is just something biological, it's innate, this is what mothers tend to do, and like so the mother who does that is probably causally determined. But that doesn't in any way like threaten our sense that it's appropriate to praise her for what she's doing and admire her for what she's doing.
Yeah, I feel like we moved off though into this other argument of structure now. But
sorry. But I just wanted to say like there's a starting point where I think the compatibilists can like make some arguments to say why, like on the far end of the 4 case, like the ordinary causal determinism, why we should regard these agents as being praiseworthy and blameworthy for what they do, and then move. Not just assert it or beg the question.
Okay, so the reason I'm jumping in is because I mean there is this really interesting methodological dispute about whether our sort of ordinary intuitions about things that people do that might be causally determined in the normal way are sort of fair game as part of what should drive our views of stuff like the 4 case argument, or whether we should sort of put that aside for the sake of neutrality while we're trying to decide, because that's the issue. And I'm sure there's a lot that can be said about that. If you guys wanted to do like a 4-hour debate about this, I would totally watch it, right? And I would even stream it back here later, But because we're not going to do that now, I do want to switch gears a little bit because I don't want this to get lost in this, right? So I think people have, I hope at this point, a little bit of a sense of what the respective positions are, of what Ryan thinks is necessary for free will, why and sufficient, for free will, why Gregg doesn't think that would be sufficient for free will, and a little bit of, at least a little taste of how the debate actually proceeds about these positions. But since I know it's something that Gregg has a lot to say about, and I want to make sure we get to it, I want to switch gears a little bit to a slightly different question, for the last part of this today, right? Which is, okay, let's assume for the sake of argument that Gregg is right? So the 4-hour debate happens, and we're all convinced by Gregg about that there's no such thing as moral responsibility. Given that, right? What are the takeaways? Because I think this is a separate debate. I think it's important to keep it separate, right, analytically. But I think it's just really interesting, and it's something that I know Gregg has a ton to say about, right? What are the takeaways for ordinary behavior, for how to think about punishment and the justification for punishment? Like what's the if Gregg is right, should we be disturbed by that? Should we like celebrate it because now we actually have a reason to do all sorts of like things that are nice and humane anyway? Like what's the Gregg, you want to kind of start us up on some of this?
Yeah. And I'm actually interested to hear what Ryan thinks here, because you don't necessarily have to all be pessimistic about the view, but I assume we might be. I'm an optimistic skeptic, so I call myself a free will skeptic, but I also think the practical implications of free will skepticism are not things to be feared, that life without free will is not only possible, but preferable. And so I'm actually optimistic about the implications, both in our interpersonal context, our relationships, and also in the realm of, say, criminal justice. And part of my optimism is based in the idea that although it's traditionally thought that, we really need to retain things like resentment and indignation and moral anger and blame, or to quote the title of my book with Dan Dennett, the concept of just desserts, not deserts of what we eat after dinner, but the idea that some people deserve fundamentally and intrinsically blame and punishment, as well as praise and reward. That, and Dennett thinks we need to preserve this notion of just desserts, that he says several times, if we were to give it up, we'd end up in a Hobbesian state of nature where life is solitary, poor, nasty, gruesome, short. And I sort of say, like, I just don't know why people think this. Because I've never actually myself, even before I was convinced of the view, never really thought that would be the case. But second, it's an empirical question, of course, and so I don't think anyone should be overly confident. But I'm more optimistic about the prospects of what life would be like, and this is partly because I think the notion of just desserts is too often used to justify like excessively punitive forms of criminal justice, to encourage sort of treating people in severe and demeaning ways, even perpetuating economic inequality and sort of the notion of blaming the victim. Like if you're in poverty, you somehow deserve to be in poverty because you should have been able to pull yourself up from the bootstraps and overcome your circumstances. Oh, and if you succeeded in life, it was all your own doing. It wasn't because your father gave you a trust fund and started you off with $3 million or whatever Trump and others, people ended up getting. And so part of it for me is like I just fundamentally disagree with Ryan, I think, about the need to preserve these reactive attitudes in our interpersonal relationships. Like take moral anger, for example. Moral anger, yes, it plays a current really important role in our interpersonal relationships, but it also is quite often corrosive to our interpersonal relationships and counterproductive for the forward-looking purposes that I think Ryan and I and Dennett and everyone else sort of agree should be the goal, which is moral formation of agents, turning our children into the kind of moral agents we want them to be, protecting society, making us safer, and reconciliation with people who've harmed us in some sort of way. Moral anger often stands in the way of reconciliation. It often is counterproductive from a pedagogical style or from a parenting style. I mean, think of teachers. I think often of the example of an art critique, because I used to be chair of our humanities department that included the art faculty. So students put their artwork up in the front of the class, and people ask them to, why'd you make these choices? Why'd you use yellow instead of red or something? I think that there are kinds of moral responsibility that are consistent with giving up free will, and they're forward-looking accounts. So I'll come back to this in a second. But the idea that you can engage someone in a kind of moral conversation. Why did you make the choice you made? I think you could preserve axiological judgments of good and bad and right and wrong. And so I could ask my daughter, why did you do this thing in school? Do you think this was the right thing to do? What kind of choices can you make in the future that would be different? You think there's some fact about yourself that may have led you to make this choice? Do you think maybe we could work for changing that feature of yourself? I think that's all consistent in a way that the art critique would be. You ask, why did you choose to use yellow? Or why did you choose this shape? Could we chose a different shape? And you're moving pedagogically toward this forward-looking goal of, in this case, artistic development or moral development. I think almost all of us agree that a teacher exerting some kind of reactive attitude of resentment or indignation or moral anger at an aesthetic choice would be unjustified. And yet in the context of moral cases, we think it's totally justified. But we could see whether or not I think it's unjustified in both cases, but I could say what you could often see from the aesthetic case is that pedagogically it would be harmful, right? Not only would it be unjustified for the teacher, the professor to blame the person for choosing yellow or get angry at them for having made an aesthetic choice. It would prevent that person from learning from that choice and perhaps developing and changing themselves moving forward. And so I think moral anger often gets this kind of corrosive attitude in this interpersonal context. I'll just say one last thing. On the empirical grounds, I would say that I grant this, that we haven't really had many societies that have, become model examples of what the skeptical world would look like. That said, and I think this is a really important point that often doesn't get talked about in the Straussonian literature, is I think there might be a weird assumption going on in Strawson. I want to write a paper, I will write this paper eventually, called The Weird Moral Psychology of Straussonians, where I'm sure Ben is familiar with this term of weird. It's a social psychological term that was developed to point to the fact that like all these studies done on human nature and tell us, human nature is one way or another, are all done on weird populations, weird like, in Western educated, industrial, rich, and democratic.
Yeah,
So
like,
they're all
like
these
it's all Western
undergraduates
college
from,
students. Yeah,
yeah, they're all
yeah,
Stanford
yeah,
and Harvard and
yeah,
Cornell undergrads. And then we say human nature is such because we ran some prison experiment at Stanford, right?
Mhm.
The idea, though, is that these populations are weird in two senses. They're weird not only because they're just Western, industrial, educated, rich, democratic. They're weird because Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic nations are outliers in the historical context of our species. They're more the exception than the norm. And what I would say is when Strawsonians assume that these reactive attitudes, and not all reactive attitudes are under dispute, the only ones that are really under dispute are the ones that presuppose basic desert, resentment, indignation, moral anger, retributive reactive attitudes. Might be weird assumptions. It might be a weird assumption that we can't live without these. And I think that if you were to look at, to borrow a term from Owen Flanagan, the kind of moral variation of what he calls moral ecologies that have developed over time in different civilizations. Think of things like honor cultures. Honor cultures have a completely different set of moral practices than Western individual moral responsibility systems. So in an honor culture, if Ben harms my family in some way, two things have to occur. I, the victim, have to be the one who retaliates, not some third-party justice like we have in our society, where the criminal justice system or the legal system would be doing the retaliation to the wrongdoer. I have to do it, because if I don't do it, I'm somehow vulnerable to the future and will be just a victim, and people will think they could just take advantage of me. And second, anyone on Ben's tribe, your friends, your family, anyone on your team is a legitimate target. It doesn't have to be the wrongdoer. And so it's not tracking responsibility or individual blame in any way, right? And this honor culture evolved because it worked. It worked in the practical sense of worked for its moral ecology. The moral ecology of honor cultures tended to be cultures with no stable third-party justice. There was no strong state to administer justice. So the individual had to administer justice, otherwise they would become, susceptible to further victimization. And it works in these small little societies. Now we've abandoned honor cultures, and I think that's good. I'm not defending honor cultures here. They're terrible in many ways. But that's just to say, I think we might be short-sighted in assuming the Strawsonian weird assumptions about our individualistic system of responsibility is the only game in town, and that if we were to abandon it, all society would crumble. I think that is too much of a weird assumption, and that when you actually do cross-cultural studies of different societies and how they've viewed moral psychology, you might realize that there's more variation and variability that's possible. And therefore, if that's true, the optimistic skeptic can say there might be better ways of living. There might be better ways of organizing our individual personal relationships that might work more effectively, be more humane, possibly more justified if I'm right philosophically, and not be harmful, might actually produce better outcomes in this forward-looking sense.
Okay, so I was, even though, right, that was super interested, you got into the thing that I would most like to argue with you about if we had time, but I'll just refer people to the episode with David Pizarro that we did on G.A. Cohen, which is the relationship between the sort of economic inequality issue and the control and responsibility issue, right? I think the Cohen argument is going to be that it's like the other way around, right? That you sort of need that distinction to make sense of what's so objectionable about the kinds of inequality that we have. But like I said, I'll just refer people to that because we really do need to wrap up the segment in the next 5 minutes. So Ryan, do what you can in 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. Okay, there's a lot to respond to here. So I very quickly want to say this. So like I'm in a weird position here where I do think we lose some important things if we lose these reactive attitudes. but I'm not like Dennett, where I think that throws us into a Hobbesian state of nature. Like, so I actually like I really admire your work on this stuff, you and Parabom and all these other guys. Like and it's like it's in some ways it has changed my thinking on something. So like I do think there are things we can change and should change. Like I want to move away from retributivism in the criminal justice system. Like I think that would be a good thing to do. But I do still think there's an essential role for some basic desert responsibility in the criminal justice system as well. Sorry. So I'm trying to think what to focus on here in my 2 minutes. So I'll say like one thing I think so I agree like with your examples, like it would be bad pedagogy to use moral anger in the art critique taste. Also, probably generally like bad to rely on moral anger much with parenting. Like that's not the best way to morally educate a child. But I do think moral anger still plays some like really essential roles in our relationships. So, for example, especially with people who are victims. And so, like one thing's interesting about both of those examples is the teacher and the parent is the person in power. And so, you know, I also, and I take this from like Michelle Curie and some other people recently, who say, you know, like if you're in a position of power, you're kind of less entitled to rely on moral anger. But people who are oppressed, moral anger actually plays an important role for them. And it can be powerful. It can be motivating. It can be a powerful way to communicate what the oppressors are doing wrong. So I do think moral anger plays some roles, but where I think we really get some losses is in other attitudes related to anger. So things like regret, things like forgiveness, things like real apology. I think these attitudes are really important to relationships. And I agree, like there probably are a lot of ways we can set up societies that instantiate these things in very different ways, but these seem like really essential features. And I know some skeptics want to argue we can still maintain corollaries of these attitudes that would be close enough. But I'm somewhat skeptical of that. So I think that we probably like to go back to the manipulation argument. Like, it's just, you know, we're assuming you're right that manipulation is really analogous to just ordinary causal determination. If I learned that someone was really manipulated, thoroughly manipulated by neuroscientists, and when they did something wrong to me, it wouldn't make sense for that person to apologize, and it would no longer make. I mean, it wouldn't make sense for me to be angry, but also wouldn't make sense for me to forgive them. It wouldn't really make sense for them to apologize, and just be like, well, you know, it's the neuroscientists that did it, not you. And if you're right that the laws of physics and determinism are analogous to that, then it seems like we lose a whole lot of stuff.
So I could see that Gregg really wants to argue with that about that. I suspect that there's enough to go on there to go back and forth about this for a long time. I hope, in fact, we could actually do a part 2 of this at some point.
I would love to do a part 2. I'd especially love to dive into Gregg's views of justice and his quarantine model.
Yeah, I didn't even get the punishment.
Which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that's actually maybe once you kind of let go, which I actually agree that you should, let go of the idea that like, we're just going to have, whatever, people eating each other, and doubt is up, and dogs and cats are going to be living together. If you don't have these concepts, I think, that's probably a little much, right? I think there's a more interesting argument to be had about what the effect would be about how we think about criminal justice, what we think about stuff like inequality, and like the good and bad things about that. And I would really like to have both of you back on to talk about that stuff. But Gregg, one last quick point.
Yeah, I'm not going to respond to Ryan. I'll just plug something for further reading.
Please.
Dirk Pierboom and I have a forthcoming little book. It's like 3,000 words, it's 30,000 words. It's part of a Cambridge Element series. They're free and they're open source and open access. It should be out, I don't know, hopefully in a couple of months. Moral Responsibility, Skepticism. And we're going to, part of it is actually sort of getting to the questions of Ryan. So I'll just say readers could check it out. Like, we do argue that you could preserve things like self-guilt and apology, and certain things make sense even without basic desert. But I just plug in instead of make the arguments and say maybe we could have this conversation again.
Cool.
All right.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Awesome.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.